Welcome back, guys. Welcome to another story here on the channel. Let's talk about a world where love is a luxury few can afford, where marriage is a battlefield disguised as celebration, and where the most intimate moments of life are orchestrated by forces beyond your control. Tonight, we journey back to ancient Rome, not to witness the grandeur of the Colosseum or the might of the legions, but to explore something far more personal and perhaps more treacherous, the institution of marriage. In our modern world, we speak of finding our soulmate, of choosing our partner, of building a life together based on mutual affection and shared dreams. We swipe through profiles, court with flowers, and propose with rings chosen from the heart. We believe in compatibility, in growing together, in the sacred bond of mutual choice. Please consider subscribing and hit the like button. But imagine, if you will, awakening in a society where marriage is a transaction, where your spouse is selected not by your heart, but by your family's ambition, where the wedding bed becomes a stage for political theater, and where survival depends not on love, but on your ability to navigate a web of expectations, deceptions, and unspoken rules. The Romans, masters of conquest and law, architects of empire and civilization, approached marriage with the same calculated precision they brought to warfare. It was a contract sealed in gold and blood, a performance that could elevate a family to greatness or destroy it utterly. For most Romans, marriage was not about happiness. It was about survival, strategy, and the perpetuation of power. The wedding vows were not promises of devotion, but declarations of alliance, and the marriage bed was often the most dangerous battlefield of all. Picture yourself waking up not to the freedom of choice, but to the weight of expectation. Your parents have been negotiating your future since you were barely old enough to understand what marriage meant. Your dowry has been calculated, your bloodline evaluated, your worth measured not in personal qualities, but in political connections and financial assets. You are not a person seeking love. You are a commodity in the grand marketplace of Roman society, and your marriage is simply another business transaction in the endless pursuit of status and survival. As we settle into this exploration together, let the weight of your modern freedoms fall away. Feel yourself transported to a time when your most intimate choices were made by others, when love was a whispered secret rather than a celebrated foundation, and when the very institution meant to bind two souls together often became the mechanism that would tear them apart. Tonight, we will walk through the marble halls of Roman homes, witness the calculated smiles of arranged unions, and understand why the simple act of marriage in ancient Rome was perhaps one of the most dangerous games a person could play. This is the story of Roman marriage, beautiful, brutal, and utterly alien to everything we believe about love today. You are 14 years old, and today your life ends as you know it, not through death, but through something the Romans consider far more significant: marriage. The morning sun filters through the narrow windows of your father's house, casting long shadows across the mosaic floor where you sit, hands folded in your lap, waiting for a stranger who will become your husband before the day is through. Your mother moves about the room with practiced efficiency, adjusting your stola, ensuring every fold of fabric falls perfectly. She has been preparing for this moment since the day you were born, and now that it has arrived, her face betrays no emotion save the satisfaction of a negotiation well concluded. You have seen your intended husband perhaps 3 times in your life. The first was at a dinner party when you were 12, where he sat across the triclinium, speaking with your father about grain imports while you served wine with trembling hands. The second was in the forum, where he nodded curtly in your direction before disappearing into the crowd of togas. The third was yesterday, when he came to finalize the marriage contract, a document that outlined your dowry, your expected behavior, and the terms under which you could be divorced. You are not present for this meeting, of course. Your future was decided in a room you were not permitted to enter, by men who spoke of you as if you were a particularly valuable piece of property. That your husband-to-be is 31 years old, a friend of your father's from the same social circle, a man who needs a wife to advance his political career and provide him with heirs. You know he owns a villa outside the city, that he has business interests in Gaul, and that his previous wife died in childbirth 3 years ago. These are the facts that matter in Roman society. You do not know whether he is kind or cruel, whether he laughs easily or struggles with melancholy, whether he will treat you as a partner or a possession. Such considerations are luxuries that Roman marriages cannot afford. The marriage negotiations began 8 months ago, though you were unaware of them at the time. Your father, recognizing that you were approaching marriageable age, had quietly begun assessing potential matches within his social network. The process was delicate, requiring careful attention to family connections, financial stability, and political advantage. Your prospective husband's family had likewise been evaluating available young women, considering factors such as dowry size, family reputation, and breeding potential. When both families concluded that an alliance would be mutually beneficial, the formal discussions began. Your dowry was substantial, a carefully calculated sum that demonstrated your family's wealth without appearing excessive. It included money, property, slaves, and valuable objects, all of which would pass to your husband upon marriage, but would return to your family should you be widowed or divorced without cause. The negotiations over these terms were intense, with both families employing skilled speakers to argue their positions. Your father wanted to ensure you would be provided for, while your future husband's family sought to maximize their gain. The final agreement was a masterpiece of Roman legal precision, covering every conceivable scenario and leaving nothing to chance. But now, as you sit in the pre-dawn darkness of your wedding day, the careful calculations and strategic planning feel distant and abstract. The reality is immediate and overwhelming. In a few hours, you will be bound to a man you barely know, expected to share his bed, bear his children, and navigate the treacherous waters of Roman domestic politics. Your success will be measured not by your happiness, but by your ability to produce male heirs, maintain your husband's honor, and avoid the kind of scandal that could destroy both your families. The art of being a Roman wife begins with the art of concealment. You must learn to smile when you feel like weeping, to appear interested when you are bored, to project contentment when you are miserable. Your emotions are not your own. They are potential weapons that could be used against your family's interests. A wife who appears unhappy reflects poorly on her husband's ability to manage his household. A wife who seems discontent suggests that her family has not properly prepared her for married life. Every expression, every gesture, every word must be carefully calibrated to project the image of a perfect Roman. Matron. Your days will be structured around your husband's needs and preferences. You will rise before dawn to ensure that his breakfast is prepared according to his specifications. You will manage the household slaves, overseeing their work with the kind of attention to detail that would impress a military commander. Will receive visitors, entertaining your husband's friends and business associates with the proper mixture of charm and deference. You will attend social functions, always positioned slightly behind your husband, speaking only when addressed, laughing at his jokes whether they amuse you or not. The rhythm of Roman marriage is one of careful performance. Every interaction is choreographed, every response calculated. When your husband speaks, you listen with apparent fascination, even if he is recounting the same story you have heard dozens of times. When he expresses an opinion, you nod thoughtfully, even if you privately disagree. When he criticizes something you have done, you accept the rebuke gracefully, thanking him for his guidance and promising to do better. This is not hypocrisy, it is survival. A wife who challenges her husband's authority, who expresses independence, thoughts, who fails to maintain the proper facade of submissive contentment, risks not only her own position, but the reputation of her entire family. The physical intimacy of marriage is perhaps the most challenging aspect for a young Roman bride. You have been given minimal preparation for what will be expected of you, receiving only the most basic instruction from your mother or a trusted slave. The wedding night is an ordeal to be endured rather than enjoyed, a duty that must be performed. With the same stoic acceptance that characterizes all aspects of Roman life, your husband's pleasure is the priority. Your own feelings are irrelevant. You must learn to respond appropriately to his advances, to appear willing even when you are, not to hide any pain or discomfort that might diminish his satisfaction. Pregnancy, when it comes, brings both relief and new anxieties. A pregnant wife has fulfilled her primary function, but she has also entered a period of extreme vulnerability. Childbirth is dangerous, and many young women do not survive the experience. Those who do survive face the constant pressure to produce. Male heirs, as daughters, while valued, cannot carry on the family name or inherit property. A wife who fails to bear sons may find herself divorced, her dowry returned, her reputation permanently damaged. The specter of your husband's previous wife, who died attempting to give him the heir he desperately needed, hangs over every aspect of your new existence. The social world of Roman marriage is equally treacherous. You must navigate complex relationships with your husband's family, particularly his mother, who may view you as a threat to her influence. You must manage friendships with other wives, being careful not to appear too intimate with any particular woman, lest you be accused of forming dangerous alliances. You must attend the endless round of social functions that dominate upper-class Roman life, always aware that every conversation is being evaluated, every gesture analyzed for signs of impropriety or disloyalty. Your education, such as it was, focused on the practical skills necessary for household management, rather than the intellectual pursuits that might have interested you. You learned to read and write, but only well enough to keep household accounts and correspond with family members. You studied music and dancing, but only as social accomplishments that might enhance your marriage prospects. You were taught the fundamentals of religion, but only those aspects that related to your duties as a wife and mother. Any broader intellectual curiosity was discouraged as inappropriate for a woman of good family. The loneliness of Roman marriage is profound and permanent. You are surrounded by people, your husband, your slaves, your social circle, but you are fundamentally alone. Your thoughts and feelings must be carefully guarded, shared with no one. Your dreams and aspirations have been subsumed into your husband's ambitions. Your identity has been reshaped to fit the requirements of your new role. The young woman who woke up this morning in her father's house will not exist by evening. In her place will be a Roman wife, a creature of duty and deference, a player in a game whose rules she is still learning and whose stakes she is only beginning to understand as the sun rises higher and the sounds of the city begin to penetrate the walls of your family's home. You prepare yourself for the transformation that awaits. You will smile. You will comply. You will adapt. You will become everything that Roman society expects of a wife, burying your own desires so deeply that you may forget they ever existed. This is not tragedy. It is simply the reality of Roman marriage, a system designed to serve the needs of family and state rather than the happiness of individuals. And if you are very lucky, very skilled, and very careful, you might even survive it. The wedding ceremony itself is a masterpiece of Roman theater, designed not to celebrate love, but to display wealth, confirm alliances, and establish the new social hierarchy that your marriage creates. You stand in the atrium of your father's house, surrounded by guests who have come not to witness your happiness, but to evaluate the political implications of this union. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense and the murmur of calculated conversations. Every detail has been choreographed to project success and stability, from the elaborate decorations to the carefully selected guest list. Your wedding dress. The flammeum is a vibrant saffron yellow that catches the light streaming through the compluvium above. The color is traditional, symbolic of fertility and prosperity, but it also serves a practical purpose. It marks you as a bride, distinguishing you from the other women present and signaling your transition from daughter to wife. The fabric is expensive imported silk that demonstrates your family's wealth and status. The veil that covers your face is so fine it seems to float around you, creating an almost ethereal effect that adds to the ceremonial atmosphere. Beneath the beautiful exterior, however, you are acutely aware of the performance you must maintain. Your face, when glimpsed through the veil, must project the proper mixture of modesty and contentment. You cannot appear too eager, lest you seem immodest, but you cannot appear reluctant, lest you dishonor your family's arrangement. Your posture must be perfect straight, but not rigid, graceful, but not theatrical. Your voice, when required to speak the ritual words, must be clear, but not too confident, audible, but not attention-seeking. The religious aspects of this ceremony are elaborate and precise. The auspices have been taken, the entrails examined, the omens interpreted. Everything has been declared favorable, though you suspect this outcome was predetermined, regardless of what the priests actually observed. The gods must be seen to approve of this union, and the ceremony cannot proceed without their blessing. You participate in the ritual sacrifice, your hands guided by the priest as you help pour the wine and sprinkle the grain. The warm blood of the sacrificial lamb pools on the stone altar, and you force yourself not to flinch as the smell reaches your nostrils. Your husband-to-be stands beside you throughout the ceremony, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. He is performing his own role, projecting the image of a successful Roman citizen taking a wife to further his family's interests. His toga is immaculate, his posture confident, his expression appropriately solemn. When he speaks the ritual words that will bind you together, his voice is steady and clear. When he looks at you, his gaze is appraising rather than affectionate, evaluating his acquisition rather than expressing devotion. The formal exchange of vows is brief and practical. There are no promises of eternal love, no declarations of devotion, no romantic sentiments. Instead, you pledge to be a faithful wife, to obey your husband's commands, to manage his household efficiently, and to bear his children. He promises to provide for you, to protect you from harm, to treat you with the respect due to a Roman matron, and to honor the terms of the marriage contract. These are business obligations rather than emotional commitments, and both of you understand that the success of your union will be measured by how well you fulfill these practical duties. The wedding feast that follows is an elaborate display of conspicuous consumption. The guests recline on couches arranged around the atrium, served by an army of slaves who appear and disappear with mechanical precision. The food is abundant and expensive peacock and dormice, exotic fruits from distant provinces, wines from the finest vineyards. The conversation flows around topics of politics, business, and social gossip, with your marriage serving as merely one item on a long agenda of upper-class concerns. You are seated beside your new husband, but you eat little. The weight of the ceremony and the magnitude of the change in your life have left you with no appetite. You sip wine to calm your nerves, but you must be careful not to drink too much, as appearing intoxicated would be a serious breach of decorum. Your husband occasionally addresses remarks to you, and you respond with appropriate deference, your words chosen carefully to project intelligence without appearing too clever, engagement without seeming overly forward. The other women at the feast watch you with interest and evaluation. The older matrons remember their own wedding days and offer knowing glances that might be sympathy or mere acknowledgement of shared experience. The younger women, those still unmarried, study you with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, seeing in your transformation a preview of their own futures. The conversation among the women, when it touches on your marriage, focuses on practical matters: the size of your dowry, the quality of your new home, the political advantages of the alliance. As the afternoon progresses, you become increasingly aware of the evening that awaits. The wedding feast will continue until sunset, followed by the processional to your new home. And then the moment you have been dreading, the declaration ceremony that will formally consummate your marriage. The other guests speak of these events with casual familiarity, as if they were discussing the weather or the latest gladiatorial games. For them, your transition from virgin to wife is simply another item on the day's agenda. For you, it represents the final destruction of your childhood and the beginning of a life whose parameters you are only beginning to understand. The gifts presented to you and your husband are carefully chosen to reflect both the giver's status and their assessment of your marriage's importance. Expensive jewelry, fine textiles, valuable slaves, and artworks all accumulate around you, creating a material foundation for your new life. Each gift comes with subtle messages, some expressing genuine goodwill, others making political statements, still others establishing obligations that will need to be repaid in the future. You must remember each gift and its donor, as failing to acknowledge these offerings appropriately could create dangerous social complications. The afternoon light begins to fade, and you sense the approaching end of the ceremony. The conversations become more animated as the wine takes effect, but you remain carefully composed, aware that you are still being observed and evaluated. Your new mother-in-law approaches to offer formal congratulations, her words warm, but her eyes calculating. She is assessing you as a potential ally or threat, wondering whether you will support her influence over her son or challenge it. Your response must be perfectly calibrated, respectful, but not subservient, friendly but not presumptuous. The moment arrives when you must leave your father's house forever. The processional to your new home is another carefully choreographed performance, designed to display your husband's wealth and social position. You are lifted onto a decorated litter, surrounded by torchbearers and musicians, followed by a parade of slaves carrying your possessions and wedding gifts. The streets are lined with onlookers, drawn by the spectacle and curious about the political implications of this union. You wave graciously from behind your veil, projecting happiness and excitement, while internally steeling yourself for what lies ahead. Your new home is larger and more elaborate than your father's, reflecting your husband's greater wealth and social position. The slaves who greet you have been instructed in the proper protocols, and they perform their duties with the kind of precision that suggests careful training. You are introduced to the household, presented to the senior slaves who will be your primary assistants, and given a brief tour of the quarters that will be your domain. Everything is beautiful, expensive, and utterly alien. This is your new world, and you must learn to navigate it quickly and successfully. The evening meal is a more intimate affair, shared only with your husband's immediate family and closest friends. The conversation is less formal than the wedding feast, but you remain carefully guarded, aware that every word and gesture is being evaluated. Your husband's friends offer toasts to your health and fertility, their words jovial, but their intentions serious. The production of male heirs is the ultimate measure of a Roman marriage's success, and everyone present understands that your value will be determined by your ability to fulfill this fundamental obligation. As the night deepens and the guests begin to depart, you feel the weight of inevitability settling around you. The performance of the wedding day is nearly over, but the longer performance of married life is just beginning. You have successfully navigated the ceremony, projected the appropriate image, and established your place in the complex social hierarchy of Roman society. Now comes the harder task, maintaining this performance day after day, year after year, until it becomes so natural that you forget it is performance at all. The final moments before you retire to your marriage chamber are filled with ritual and symbolism. Your husband's friends make increasingly ribald jokes about the night ahead, while the matrons offer cryptic advice about wifely duties. You are presented with symbolic gifts: a spindle to represent your domestic responsibilities, a key to represent your authority over the household, a small statue of a fertility goddess to ensure your reproductive success. Each item carries weight beyond its material value, serving as a reminder of the expectations that will govern your new life. Your wedding day ends not with celebration, but with resignation. You have successfully completed the first phase of your transformation from daughter to wife, but the real test lies ahead. Tomorrow, you will wake up in a strange house, bound to a man you barely know, responsible for managing a household of slaves and servants, expected to produce children who will carry on your husband's family name. The young woman who woke up this morning in her father's house is gone forever, replaced by a Roman wife whose success will be measured not by her happiness, but by her ability to fulfill the duties and expectations that Roman society has placed upon her shoulders. The first year of your marriage unfolds like a carefully constructed play, each day bringing new scenes in which you must learn your lines, understand your blocking, and perfect your performance. The morning routines become rituals of transformation as you wait before dawn to prepare yourself for another day of being the perfect Roman wife. The bronze mirror reflects back a face that is learning to smile on command, eyes that are mastering the art of appearing interested when you feel nothing, hands that have grown skilled at the subtle gestures that communicate respect and submission. Your husband's house operates according to rhythms that are both foreign and inflexible. The household slaves rise with the first light, beginning their tasks with a precision that speaks of years of training and the constant threat of punishment. You learn to move through this choreographed world, understanding that every disruption to the established order reflects poorly on your ability to manage your new domain. The head slave, a Greek woman named Syra, who has served your husband's family for 15 years, becomes your unwilling tutor in the complex hierarchy of domestic management. The breakfast routine establishes the pattern for all your interactions. Your husband expects his morning meal to be prepared exactly as he prefers it: warm bread with honey, fresh fruit arranged in a specific pattern, wine mixed with water in proportions that must never vary. You learn to anticipate his needs, to have his toga prepared and his sandals cleaned, to ensure that his morning correspondence is organized and waiting. These tasks might seem simple, but they require constant attention and flawless execution. A single mistake: bread that is too cool, wine that is too strong, a missing document can result in criticism that echoes through the household for days. The social calendar that governs your new life is a complex web of obligations, each with its own protocols and potential dangers. The morning salutatio brings a steady stream of clients and associates to your husband's house. Men seeking favors, offering services, or simply maintaining the relationships that are essential to political and commercial success. You must appear for these occasions, positioned appropriately to demonstrate your husband's prosperity, while remaining sufficiently in the background to avoid appearing forward. Your role is to be seen but not heard, to project contentment and stability while the men conduct their business. The afternoon visits to other households require different skills entirely. You accompany your husband to the homes of his peers, where you must navigate the complex social dynamics of Roman high society. The wives of these men are your new peers, but they are also potential rivals, women who might support your family's interests or work against them, depending on circumstances you are only beginning to understand. Every conversation is a careful dance of revelation and concealment, as you share just enough personal information to seem friendly, while revealing nothing that could be used against you. The evening entertainments are perhaps the most challenging aspect of your new life. The dinner parties that are central to Roman social life require you to be charming, but not attention-seeking, intelligent, but not threatening, beautiful, but not provocative. You learn to recline gracefully on the dining couches, to eat delicately, while appearing to enjoy the elaborate courses, to laugh at jokes that are often crude or cruel. The wine flows freely at these gatherings, but you must remain sober while your husband and his friends become increasingly intoxicated and indiscreet. Relationship with your husband evolves slowly, shaped more by routine than by affection. He is not deliberately cruel, but neither is he particularly kind. You are a useful acquisition, a woman who enhances his social standing and will hopefully provide him with the sons he needs to secure his legacy. Your conversations are limited to practical matters, household management, social obligations, his business concerns. He shows little interest in your thoughts or feelings, and you learn not to offer them. The intimacy of marriage, such as it is, occurs in darkness and silence, a duty to be performed rather than a pleasure to be shared. The management of the household slaves becomes one of your primary responsibilities, and you discover that this role requires skills that no one has taught you. The slaves are not merely servants, but complex individuals with their own personalities, ambitions, and grievances. Some are loyal and efficient, others are resentful and rebellious, still others are simply incompetent. You must learn to identify each type, to manage them appropriately, and to maintain discipline without creating the kind of unrest that would reflect poorly on your abilities. Sira, the head slave, presents a particular challenge. She has managed your husband's household for years and clearly resents the disruption that your arrival has caused. She knows the routines better than you do, understands your husband's preferences more thoroughly, and has established relationships with the other slaves that you cannot easily disrupt. Yet your authority over her is absolute, and she must accept your decisions even when she disagrees with them. The tension between you is constant, but carefully concealed, expressed through subtle gestures and coded language that would be invisible to casual observers. The other slaves watch this dynamic with interest and concern. Some hope that your arrival will improve their conditions, while others fear that change will make their lives more difficult. The kitchen slaves, responsible for preparing the elaborate meals that your husband's status requires, are particularly sensitive to any disruption in routine. The body slaves, who attend to personal needs and maintain the family's appearance, must learn your preferences while continuing to serve your husband according to his established habits. The field slaves, who work the properties outside the city, are more distant, but no less important to the households. Overall functioning. Your relationship with your husband's mother proves to be one of the most delicate aspects of your new life. She has retained significant influence over the household, despite her son's marriage, and she clearly views you as a potential threat to her position. Her criticisms are always indirect but unmistakably pointed comments about how differently things were done in her day. Suggestions about household management that contradict your decisions. Observations about the declining standards of young women. You must navigate these challenges without appearing disrespectful, finding ways to assert your authority while maintaining the appearance of harmony. The religious obligations of married life provide another layer of complexity. As a Roman matron, you are expected to participate in the elaborate cycle of festivals and ceremonies that mark the calendar year. The household gods require daily attention, with offerings of food and wine presented at the appropriate times. The public festivals demand your presence, dressed in your finest clothing and projecting the image of piety and prosperity. These obligations are not merely ceremonial, but serve important social functions, demonstrating your family's commitment to traditional values and their integration into the broader Community. Your education in the practical arts of marriage continues throughout these early months. You'll learn to supervise the weaving that produces the family's clothing, to manage the preservation of food for the winter months, to oversee the maintenance of the household's physical infrastructure. These skills are essential to your role as a Roman wife, but they also represent a form of insurance should your husband die or divorce you. Your ability to manage domestic affairs efficiently will be crucial to your survival. The question of pregnancy haunts every aspect of your daily life. Your monthly cycles are monitored with obsessive attention. Any signs of morning sickness are interpreted as hopeful omens, and your diet is carefully regulated to promote fertility. The pressure to conceive is enormous, coming not only from your husband, but from both families, whose political and financial interests depend on the production of male heirs. Each month that passes without pregnancy brings increasing anxiety and subtle recriminations. The social world of Roman wives provides both companionship and competition. The other women in your circle are experiencing similar challenges, and there is some comfort in shared understanding. Yet these relationships are also fraught with tension, as each woman's success depends partly on the failures of others. A friend's pregnancy might be cause for celebration, but it also represents a reminder of your own shortcomings. A neighbor's beautiful home might inspire admiration, but it also creates pressure to improve your own. Domestic arrangements. The economic realities of marriage become increasingly apparent as the months pass. Your dowry has been invested in your husband's business ventures, and its performance directly affects your security and status. You have no independent income and limited rights to property, making your financial situation entirely dependent on your husband's success and goodwill. This dependency is both practical and psychological, creating a constant awareness of your vulnerability and the importance of maintaining your husband's favor. The letters you exchange with your birth family provide a crucial lifeline to your former identity, but they also serve as reminders of how much has changed. Your mother's correspondence is filled with advice about household management and wifely duties, while your father's letters focus on the political implications of your marriage and the importance of maintaining your family's reputation. Your younger siblings write with news of their own lives, but their experiences seem increasingly distant and irrelevant to your current existence. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life provide structure, but also highlight the repetitive nature of your new existence. Spring brings the hope of new life and the possibility of pregnancy, but it also marks another year of marriage without the dramatic changes that characterized your youth. Summer brings social obligations and the challenge of managing a household during the heat and dust of the Roman climate. Autumn brings harvest celebrations and the preparation for winter, activities that require careful planning and execution. Winter brings a quieter period of domestic focus, but also the long months of close confinement with a husband whose company you have not learned to enjoy. The first anniversary of your wedding approaches with mixed emotions. You have successfully established yourself as a competent Roman wife, managing your household efficiently and maintaining the appearance of contentment. Yet you are also increasingly aware of the limitations of your situation and the likelihood that your current existence will continue largely unchanged for the remainder of your life. The young woman who once dreamed of adventure and romance has been replaced by a skilled performer who can project happiness while feeling nothing, who can manage complex social situations while maintaining perfect composure, who can survive in a world that offers little comfort and less freedom. The art of being a Roman wife, you have learned, is ultimately the art of disappearing. Your individual desires, your personal ambitions, your emotional needs have all been subsumed into the larger requirements of family and society. You have become a function rather than a person, a role rather than an individual. This transformation is not unique to you. It is the common experience of Roman women, the price they pay for security and social position, And if you are very skilled, very careful, and very lucky, you might even convince yourself that this is a fair exchange, that the stability and respectability of marriage compensate for the loss of freedom and authenticity that it has required. But late at night, when the household is quiet and your husband is asleep beside you, you sometimes remember the young woman you once were, and you mourn for dreams that will never be fulfilled and possibilities that will never be explored. In the grand tapestry of Roman marriage, where most women learned the art of invisibility and careful submission, there emerged a figure so audacious, so utterly defiant of convention, that her very name became synonymous with scandal and dangerous ambition. Valeria Messalina was born into the highest echelons of Roman society around 17 or 20 CE, during the reign of Tiberius, when the empire was consolidating its power and the imperial family was becoming the ultimate arbiters of Roman social order. Her lineage was impeccable, descended from Mark Antony through her mother's line and connected to the Julian family through various marriage alliances that had been carefully cultivated over generations. From her earliest years, Messalina inhabited a world where ordinary rules seemed not to apply. While other Roman girls were being trained in the arts of domestic submission and marital obedience, she grew up in the rarefied atmosphere of imperial privilege, where power was the ultimate currency and the ability to manipulate others was considered a valuable skill. Her education was far more extensive than that of typical Roman women, including not only the usual domestic arts, but also rhetoric, philosophy, and the subtle sciences of political maneuvering that were essential to survival in the imperial court. The young Messalina was described by contemporary observers as possessing extraordinary beauty, but it was a beauty enhanced by intelligence and ambition that set her apart from her peers. Her dark hair was always arranged in the latest fashion, her clothing chosen to emphasize both her status and her physical attractions, her manner carefully calculated to project confidence and allure, unlike the carefully modest demeanor expected. Of Roman matrons, Messalina seemed to understand instinctively that in the world of imperial politics, visibility and memorability were more valuable than conventional virtue. Her first marriage, arranged when she was barely out of childhood, was to a much older senator whose wealth and political connections made him a suitable match for a woman of her lineage. This marriage followed all the traditional patterns: elaborate negotiations, substantial dowry arrangements, formal ceremonies designed to display the family's status and seal their political alliance. Yet even from the beginning, there were signs that Messalina would not be content with the traditional role of Roman wife. She attended social functions with unusual frequency, spoke with notable confidence in mixed company, and seemed to collect admirers with the same systematic approach that her male relatives used to build political networks. The death of her first husband, whether from natural causes or other circumstances that were never fully investigated, left the young widow in an unusual position. Rather than retiring to a life of modest seclusion, as was expected of Roman widows, Messalina seemed to bloom in her newfound independence. She had inherited substantial wealth, possessed valuable political connections through both her marriages and her birth family, and had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman high society with remarkable skill. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, and unencumbered, a combination that was both attractive and dangerous in the rigid social structure of imperial Rome. It was during this period of widowhood that Messalina first came to the attention of Claudius, the future emperor, who was then still regarded as an unlikely candidate for supreme power. Claudius was nearly 30 years her senior, afflicted with various physical disabilities that made him an object of ridicule among the more athletically inclined Roman elite, and generally considered to be harmless and ineffectual. Yet Messalina, with her keen eye for political opportunity, seemed to recognize something in Claudius that others missed: shrewd intelligence hidden beneath his stammering exterior, and a genuine possibility that the vagaries of imperial succession might elevate him to unprecedented power. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was a masterpiece of calculated romance. Messalina presented herself as the perfect companion for a man who had been overlooked and underestimated throughout his life. She listened attentively to his scholarly interests, encouraged his intellectual pursuits, and seemed to offer the kind of understanding and acceptance that he had rarely experienced. For Claudius, the attention of this beautiful and accomplished young woman must have seemed almost miraculous. For Messalina, the relationship represented the ultimate political investment, a chance to attach herself to a man whose unexpected rise to power would carry her with him to heights that would otherwise be unimaginable. The marriage between Claudius and Messalina took place around 38 CE, when she was approximately 18 years old and he was approaching 50. The ceremony was elaborate, even by imperial standards, reflecting Claudius's newfound status as a member of the inner circle of power and Messalina's determination to establish herself as a figure of importance in her own right. The guest list included the most powerful families in Rome. The gifts were extraordinarily valuable, and the celebrations continued for days. Yet beneath the surface magnificence, informed observers might have detected signs of the unusual dynamic that would characterize this marriage. Unlike most Roman wives, who were expected to efface themselves in their husband's presence, Messalina seemed to grow more visible and assertive after her marriage to Claudius. She attended public functions with unprecedented frequency, received visitors and petitioners in her own right, and began to build a network of supporters and allies that operated independently of her husband's political organization. This behavior was unusual enough to attract comment, but it was generally interpreted as the natural exuberance of a young woman who had married into the imperial family rather than as a sign of more dangerous ambitions. The birth of their children first. Claudia Octavia in 39 CE, and then Britannicus in 41 CE provided Messalina with additional sources of power and legitimacy. As the mother of potential heirs to the imperial throne, she occupied a position of unprecedented importance in the Roman political system. Yet rather than content herself with the traditional maternal role, she seemed to view her children as additional tools in her expanding arsenal of political influence. She involved herself in their education and upbringing to an unusual degree, ensuring that they would be properly positioned to advance her interests as well as their own. The unexpected death of Caligula in 41 CE and Claudius's subsequent elevation to emperor transformed Messalina from the wife of an eccentric nobleman into the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire. The transition was handled with remarkable smoothness, suggesting that Messalina had been preparing for this possibility far longer than anyone had realized. Within days of Claudius's accession, she had established herself in the imperial palace, begun receiving foreign ambassadors and domestic petitioners, and started to exercise the kind of influence that had previously been reserved for emperors themselves. The early years of Claudius's reign were marked by competent administration and generally successful military campaigns. But they were also characterized by Messalina's increasingly visible role in imperial decision-making. She attended Senate meetings, though women were traditionally excluded from such gatherings. She received dedications from poets and artists, established her own court of supporters and advisors, and began to issue what amounted to imperial decrees in her own name. This behavior was unprecedented in Roman history and created considerable unease among the traditional aristocracy, who viewed her activities as a dangerous departure from established custom. Yet Messalina's ambitions extended far beyond the conventional exercise of imperial influence. She seemed to understand that power in Rome ultimately depended on the ability to inspire both fear and desire, and she cultivated both emotions with systematic precision. Her beauty was enhanced by increasingly elaborate clothing and jewelry that proclaimed her status while emphasizing her physical attractions. Her intelligence was displayed through patronage of artists and philosophers, who celebrated her wisdom and cultural sophistication. Her wealth was demonstrated through lavish entertainments and generous gifts that created networks of obligation and gratitude. The stories that began to circulate about Messalina's private behavior were initially dismissed as malicious gossip, the kind of rumors that inevitably surrounded powerful women in a society that was uncomfortable with female authority. Yet, as these stories became more frequent and more detailed, they began to paint the picture of a woman who was systematically violating every norm that governed Roman marriage and feminine conduct. She was said to take lovers openly, to engage in elaborate sexual competitions with professional prostitutes, to use her imperial position to compel the participation of unwilling partners. These accounts, whether entirely accurate or deliberately exaggerated, served important political functions. They provided Messalina's enemies with ammunition that could be used against her, while simultaneously enhancing her reputation for dangerous unpredictability. In a society where power was often as much about perception as reality, the belief that Messalina was capable of anything became a source of influence that was almost as valuable as actual authority. Senators who might have resisted her political initiatives found themselves complying out of fear of personal retribution. Wealthy citizens who might have opposed her economic policies discovered that cooperation was safer than resistance. Transformation of Messalina from ambitious young wife to imperial power broker represented a fundamental challenge to the Roman understanding of marriage and gender roles. She had refused to disappear into her husband's identity, instead creating a parallel sphere of influence that operated according to its own rules and served its own interests. She had rejected the traditional feminine virtues of modesty and self-effacement, instead embracing a model of female behavior that was both fascinating and terrifying to contemporary observers. Her relationship with Claudius during this period appears to have been complex and evolving. There is evidence that he was genuinely fond of her, proud of her intelligence and accomplishments, and grateful for her support during his unlikely rise to power. Yet there are also indications that he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with her independence and the rumors that surrounded her behavior. The private conversations between them must have been charged with tension, as two strong-willed individuals negotiated the boundaries of power within their marriage and their empire. The political elite of Rome watched this dynamic with fascination and growing alarm. Messalina represented something entirely new in their experience, a woman who wielded power not through the traditional channels of family connection and domestic influence, but through direct political action and personal charisma. She was creating precedents that could fundamentally alter the role of women in Roman society, and the implications of these changes were both exciting and terrifying to different segments of the population. As the 40s CE progressed, Messalina's influence continued to expand, and her behavior became increasingly bold and unconventional. She was building something unprecedented in Roman history, a model of imperial marriage that challenged every assumption about the proper relationship between husbands and wives, public and private life, masculine and feminine authority. Yet she was also creating the conditions for her own destruction, as the very audacity that made her powerful also made her vulnerable to the forces that sought to preserve traditional order and conventional morality. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill became Messalina's stage, and she transformed it into a theater of power that operated according to rules she wrote herself. The vast complex of interconnected buildings, gardens, and courtyards that had once housed Augustus and his successors now echoed with the sound of Messalina's revolutionary approach to imperial life. Where previous empresses had maintained the fiction of domestic retirement, receiving visitors in private chambers and conducting their business through intermediaries, Messalina held court in the grand reception halls. Surrounded by the symbols of imperial authority and the trappings of divine majesty. Her daily routine was a carefully choreographed performance designed to demonstrate her unprecedented position in the Roman hierarchy. She rose before dawn, not to prepare her husband's breakfast like an ordinary Roman wife, but to review the reports from her network of informants and agents throughout the empire. Her morning toilette was an elaborate ceremony attended by dozens of slaves and freedwomen, each responsible for a specific aspect of her appearance. Her hair was arranged in increasingly complex styles that required hours of preparation. Her clothing selected from fabrics that came from the furthest reaches of the empire. Her jewelry chosen to emphasize both her wealth and her divine status as the wife of a god emperor. The audiences she granted in the morning hours attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean world. Provincial governors sought her support for their policies. Wealthy merchants requested her intercession in commercial disputes. Foreign ambassadors presented gifts and sought treaties that would protect their nation's interests. Unlike the traditional role of imperial women, who might influence policy through private conversations with their husbands, Messalina made decisions openly and expected them to be implemented immediately. Her word carried the weight of imperial authority, and those who ignored her instructions did so at their own peril. Her relationship with the Roman Senate was particularly complex and threatening to traditional order. While senators had grown accustomed to managing the eccentricities of male emperors, they found themselves completely unprepared for a woman who demanded recognition as a political equal. Messalina attended Senate meetings regularly, though she was careful to position herself in ways that maintained the fiction of feminine deference. She would sit in the gallery reserved for imperial family members, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Senators found themselves glancing in her direction before speaking, seeking her approval for their proposals and modifying their arguments. Based on her subtle but unmistakable reactions, the traditional aristocratic families of Rome watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and horror. For generations, they had maintained their power through careful adherence to established customs and the subtle manipulation of social networks that operated largely behind closed doors. Messalina's open exercise of authority threatened to disrupt these carefully maintained arrangements. Her willingness to promote new men to positions of influence, her support for policies that favored commercial interests over traditional agricultural wealth, and her obvious disdain for many of the customs that governed elite behavior created the possibility that the entire social order might be transformed. Yet it was Messalina's personal behavior, rather than her political activities, that ultimately captured the imagination of Roman society and created the scandal that would define her legacy. The stories that circulated about her private life were so extraordinary that they seemed to belong to mythology rather than history. She was said to have established a private brothel within the imperial palace, where she entertained lovers drawn from every level of Roman society. She allegedly competed with Rome's most famous prostitutes in contests of sexual endurance, winning through a combination of stamina and shamelessness that left her professional rivals defeated and exhausted. These accounts, preserved in the works of historians like Tacitus and Pliny, were certainly influenced by the moral outrage and political opposition that Messalina inspired among the traditional elite. Yet they also reflected genuine shock at behavior that violated every norm that governed respectable Roman women. Whether the specific details were accurate or exaggerated, the underlying reality was clear. Messalina was using sexuality as a tool of power in ways that were unprecedented and threatening to the established order. Her affairs were not random acts of passion, but carefully calculated political maneuvers. Each lover was chosen for strategic reasons: to gather information, to secure loyalty, to demonstrate her power over men who thought themselves beyond her reach. Senators who had dismissed her as merely an ambitious woman found themselves compromised by their own desires. Their resistance to her policies undermined by their participation in her private entertainments. Wealthy merchants discovered that access to her bed provided commercial advantages that could transform their fortunes. Even slaves and freedmen learned that Messalina's favor could elevate them to positions that would otherwise be impossible to achieve. The imperial marriage between Messalina and Claudius became a subject of intense speculation and gossip throughout Roman society. Claudius, despite his intelligence and political acumen, seemed either unaware of his wife's activities or unable to control them. Some historians suggest that he was genuinely ignorant of her behavior, protected by the isolation that surrounded all emperors and misled by advisors who feared to bring him disturbing news. Others argue that he was aware, but chose to ignore her infidelities in exchange for her political support and the stability that her influence provided. The private conversations between husband and wife during this period must have been extraordinary exercises in deception and manipulation. Messalina had mastered the art of appearing devoted while pursuing her own agenda, of projecting innocence while orchestrating scandal, of maintaining the fiction of marital harmony while systematically undermining the foundations of traditional marriage. Claudius, for his part, seems to have struggled to reconcile his genuine affection for his wife with the growing evidence of her betrayal and the increasing pressure from advisors who warned him about the dangers of her behavior. The most famous of Messalina's alleged competitions took place in the imperial palace itself, where she challenged a renowned prostitute named Scylla to determine who could satisfy more partners in a single night. According to the accounts that have survived, Messalina emerged victorious after an exhausting contest that lasted until dawn and involved dozens of participants. Whether this specific incident actually occurred is less important than what it represented: a complete rejection of the sexual modesty that was considered essential to Roman feminine virtue, and a public demonstration that the empress considered herself bound by no conventional limits. Her use of the imperial resources to facilitate these activities was equally shocking to contemporary observers. The palace slaves were reportedly trained to serve as procurers, identifying potential lovers and arranging assignations. The imperial gardens were transformed into venues for elaborate sexual entertainments that combined luxury with depravity in ways that seemed designed to challenge every assumption about proper behavior. The wealth of the empire was employed to create spectacles of sensuality that demonstrated Messalina's power while simultaneously mocking the traditional values that had supposedly made Rome great. The psychological dimensions of Messalina's behavior were as complex as its political implications. She seemed driven by a need to prove that she could transcend every limitation that Roman society imposed on women, that her beauty and intelligence could overcome any obstacle, that her will was stronger than any convention or custom. Her sexual adventures were not merely personal indulgences, but public declarations of independence from the constraints that governed other women. Each affair was a victory over the system that sought to control her, each scandal a demonstration that she could not be contained within traditional boundaries. Yet, Messalina's behavior also reflected a profound understanding of the dynamics of power in imperial Rome. She recognized that sexuality was one of the few realms where women could exercise direct authority over men, and she exploited this insight with systematic precision. Her lovers became her agents, their desire for her transformed into political loyalty, their participation in her activities creating bonds of complicity that could be used to secure their cooperation. She was building a parallel power structure based on personal attraction and intimate knowledge, creating networks of influence that operated independently of traditional political institutions. The cultural impact of Messalina's example extended far beyond the immediate circle of imperial politics. Roman women throughout the empire watched her career with fascination, seeing in her success a model of feminine power that challenged their own limitations. Some attempted to emulate her behavior, creating scandals in their own communities that reflected her influence. Others recoiled from her example, embracing traditional virtue with renewed vigor. As a way of distinguishing themselves from the empress's notorious reputation, the reaction of Roman men to Messalina's behavior was equally complex and revealing. Some were attracted by her power and availability, willing to risk everything for the chance to possess the most desired woman in the empire. Others were threatened by her independence and sought to reassert traditional masculine authority through criticism and opposition. Still others were simply fascinated by the spectacle she provided, following the details of her adventures with the same enthusiasm they brought to gladiatorial games or chariot races. The religious dimensions of Messalina's behavior added another layer of complexity to her public persona. As the wife of an emperor who was considered divine, she occupied a quasi-sacred position in Roman society. Her actions, therefore, took on theological as well as political significance, raising questions about the relationship between divine authority and moral behavior. Some interpreted her freedom from conventional constraints as evidence of her divine status, while others saw her behavior as proof that the imperial family had lost the favor of the gods. The foreign policy implications of Messalina's reputation were equally significant. Roman ambassadors throughout the Mediterranean world found themselves defending an empire whose empress was notorious for behavior that violated the moral standards of virtually every contemporary society. Foreign leaders who visited Rome were fascinated and appalled by Messalina's open exercise of authority and her flagrant violation of sexual norms. The image of Roman civilization that she projected was both attractive and threatening, demonstrating the empire's power while simultaneously suggesting that this power had corrupted its posse, SSORS. As Messalina's influence grew and her behavior became increasingly audacious, the tension within the imperial court reached dangerous levels. Traditional advisors warned Claudius about the damage that his wife's reputation was causing to imperial authority, while Messalina's supporters argued that her popularity among certain segments of society actually strengthened the regime. The emperor found himself caught between competing demands for action, unsure whether restraining his wife would solve his problems or create new ones. The palace itself became a battleground between different factions, each seeking to gain advantage through alliance with or opposition to the empress. Freedmen who had risen to positions of influence under Claudius found themselves choosing sides in a conflict that would determine not only their own futures, but the future direction of imperial policy. The traditional aristocracy sensed an opportunity to reassert their authority by destroying a woman who represented everything they opposed, while newer elements in Roman society saw in Messalina a champion of change and modernization. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test whether the Roman Empire could accommodate the kind of revolutionary marriage that Messalina had created, or whether the forces of tradition and conventional morality would ultimately prove stronger than her unprecedented combination of beauty, intelligence, and ambition. The very foundations of imperial marriage were being challenged, and the outcome would determine not only Messalina's personal fate, but the future role of women in Roman society. The year 48 CE began with Messalina at the height of her power, but it would end with her death and the complete collapse of everything she had built. The events that unfolded during those fateful months would become legendary in Roman history, not merely as a tale of personal excess and political miscalculation, but as a defining moment that revealed the fundamental limits of how far even the most powerful woman could push against the boundaries of acceptable behavior. What Messalina attempted in the autumn of 48 CE was so audacious, so completely destructive of Roman law and custom, that it forced even her most devoted supporters to abandon her, and convinced Claudius that his wife represented an existential threat to his reign and his life. The crisis began with Messalina's relationship with Gaius Silius, a young senator who combined remarkable physical beauty with considerable political ambition and a dangerous willingness to risk everything for the chance at ultimate power. Silius was not merely another of Messalina's casual lovers, but a man who seemed to match her own appetite for risk and her disdain for conventional limitations. He was married to a woman from a distinguished family, possessed substantial wealth in his own right, and enjoyed a reputation for eloquence and intelligence that made him a rising star in the Roman political world. Yet he was willing to abandon all of these advantages for the intoxicating possibility of sharing power with the most dangerous woman in the empire. Their affair began in the traditional manner of Messalina's relationships, with carefully orchestrated encounters that combined political discussion with sexual adventure. Silius was invited to private dinners at the imperial palace, where he found himself seated near the empress and drawn into conversations that revealed her extraordinary knowledge of imperial administration and foreign policy. These initial meetings were discreet and could have been dismissed as innocent social interactions, but they quickly evolved into something far more serious and threatening. What distinguished the relationship between Messalina and Silius from her previous affairs was the element of genuine emotional attachment that seemed to develop between them. Contemporary sources suggest that Messalina, for perhaps the first time in her life, found herself genuinely attracted to a man who could match her intelligence and ambition. Silius, for his part, seems to have been genuinely captivated by a woman whose combination of beauty, power, and danger represented everything he had ever desired. Their relationship transcended the calculated political maneuvering that had characterized Messalina's previous affairs and evolved into something that approached genuine passion. Yet passion, in the context of imperial Rome, was perhaps the most dangerous emotion of all. Where Messalina's previous relationships had been carefully managed to serve specific political purposes, her involvement with Silius began to consume her attention and cloud her usually excellent judgment. She started taking risks that served no strategic purpose, meeting with him in increasingly public venues, showering him with gifts that attracted unwelcome attention, and displaying a level of emotional attachment that was completely contrary to her usual calculating nature. The transformation in Messalina's behavior did not go unnoticed by the complex network of spies, informants, and political rivals who monitored every aspect of imperial life. Reports began to reach Claudius's other advisors that the empress was behaving in ways that suggested her relationship with Silius had moved beyond the boundaries of her previous affairs. These advisors, led by the powerful freedman Narcissus and Pallas, had long been concerned about Messalina's influence over imperial policy and her tendency to reward her lovers with positions and privileges that undermined traditional merit-based advancement. The political implications of Messalina's relationship with Silius were immediately apparent to anyone who understood the dynamics of imperial succession. Claudius was approaching 60 and had never enjoyed robust health. His heir, Britannicus, was still a child who would require a regency if his father died before reaching maturity. In such a scenario, Messalina would naturally serve as regent, wielding imperial power in her son's name. But if she were married to Silius rather than Claudius, her lover would be positioned to claim imperial authority, either as her husband or as the stepfather of the legitimate heir. This possibility was so threatening to the established order that it forced Messalina's enemies to begin planning active measures to destroy her influence. Yet they faced a significant challenge. Claudius remained devoted to his wife and seemed either unaware of the true nature of her relationship with Silius or unwilling to confront the implications of what he suspected. The emperor's advisors found themselves in the delicate position of needing to gather irrefutable evidence of Messalina's betrayal while avoiding accusations of disloyalty or conspiracy against the issue. imperial family got the opportunity they needed came when Messalina made the most catastrophic miscalculation of her career. Perhaps intoxicated by her previous successes in defying convention, perhaps genuinely convinced that her power was sufficient to overcome any obstacle, perhaps simply driven by emotions that had overwhelmed her political instincts, she decided to marry Silius in a formal ceremony that would legitimize their relationship according to Roman law. This decision was so unprecedented, so completely destructive of the legal and social foundations of imperial authority, that it represented nothing less than a revolution in the structure of Roman government. The wedding ceremony between Messalina and Silius took place in the autumn of 48 CE, while Claudius was away from Rome, overseeing the completion of a new harbor at Ostia. The event was planned with the same attention to detail that had characterized Messalina's other spectacular performances, but it was also conducted with a secrecy that reflected the enormous risks involved. The guest list was carefully limited to Messalina's most devoted supporters, individuals who had committed themselves so completely to her cause that they had no choice but to support even this most dangerous gamble. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of legal and religious innovation. Since Messalina was already married to Claudius, her union with Silius could not be legally recognized unless her first marriage was somehow dissolved. Yet she could not divorce Claudius without his consent, and seeking such consent would have revealed her plans and invited immediate retaliation. Instead, she seems to have relied on some combination of religious ritual and legal technicality to create a form of marriage that would be binding under certain interpretations of Roman law, while remaining technically distinct from her imperial union. The religious aspects of the ceremony were equally unprecedented. Messalina arranged for priests and augurs to perform the traditional rituals associated with Roman marriage, complete with sacrificial offerings and the invocation of divine blessing. The couple exchanged vows in the presence of witnesses, shared the ritual cake that symbolized their domestic union, and participated in all the ceremonies that would normally establish a legitimate marriage. Yet these same rituals, performed while Messalina remained legally married to the emperor, constituted a form of religious and legal blasphemy that challenged the very foundations of Roman society. The political symbolism of the wedding was impossible to ignore. By marrying Silius, Messalina was not merely committing adultery, but effectively establishing a rival claim to imperial authority. The ceremony represented a declaration that she considered herself independent of her husband's authority, and capable of forming new alliances that could reshape the political landscape of the empire. The guests who attended were not merely witnessing a wedding, but participating in what amounted to a coup attempt that could result in civil war if Claudius chose to resist. News of the ceremony reached Claudius within hours of its completion, carried by the network of informants that his advisors had established to monitor Messalina's activities. The emperor's initial reaction was reportedly one of disbelief rather than anger. The idea that his wife would attempt something so audacious seemed to defy comprehension. Yet as the reports were confirmed by multiple sources and the legal implications became clear, Claudius was forced to confront the reality that his marriage had become a threat to his throne, and possibly to his life. The response from Claudius's advisors was swift and merciless. Led by Narcissus, who had long opposed Messalina's influence, they convinced the emperor that immediate action was necessary to prevent the situation from escalating into open rebellion. Orders were dispatched for the arrest of Silius and his supporters, while Messalina was confined to the imperial palace under circumstances that made her effectively a prisoner. The wedding guests were rounded up and interrogated, their properties seized, and their political careers destroyed. Silius himself was captured within days of the ceremony, his resistance crushed by the superior forces that Narcissus had assembled. His execution was swift and public, designed to demonstrate the consequences of challenging imperial authority and to discourage others who might be tempted to follow his example. His death was accompanied by the execution of several other prominent Romans who had supported Messalina's cause, creating a bloodbath that effectively destroyed the political network she had spent years building. Messalina's own fate was decided in a series of private consultations between Claudius and his most trusted advisors. The emperor reportedly struggled with the decision, torn between his lingering affection for his wife and his recognition that her actions had made her continued existence incompatible with his own survival. The legal precedents were clear. Adultery by an imperial wife was traditionally punished by exile or death, and Messalina's marriage to Silius constituted far more than simple adultery. The end came quietly, without the dramatic confrontation that might have been expected from such an extraordinary career. Messalina was informed that she would be permitted to commit suicide, a privilege that would allow her to die with some dignity and ensure that her children would not be permanently tainted by her disgrace. When she hesitated, perhaps hoping for some last-minute reprieve or opportunity for escape, the decision was taken from her hands. A centurion arrived at her villa with orders that could not be ignored, and Valeria Messalina, the woman who had redefined the possibilities of imperial marriage, died as she had lived, defying convention to the very end. That the immediate aftermath of Messalina's death was carefully managed to minimize the political disruption and restore confidence in imperial authority. Her supporters were systematically eliminated or neutralized, their properties confiscated, their families disgraced. Her children by Claudius were declared legitimate and retained their positions in the imperial succession, though they would carry the burden of their mother's reputation for the rest of their lives. The official version of events emphasized Messalina's betrayal and the necessity of her punishment, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that the emperor had been weak or incompetent in his handling of the crisis. Yet the deeper implications of Messalina's career could not be so easily erased. She had demonstrated that a Roman woman, given sufficient intelligence, beauty, and opportunity, could accumulate power that rivaled that of the emperors themselves. She had shown that traditional marriage customs could be manipulated and subverted in ways that created entirely new forms of political authority. Most dangerously, she had proved that the imperial system itself was vulnerable to challenges that came not from external enemies or rival generals, but from within the most intimate relationships of the ruling family. The impact of Messalina's example on subsequent imperial marriages was profound and lasting. Future emperors would be far more cautious in their selection of wives, more vigilant in monitoring their behavior, and more willing to take decisive action when problems arose. The idea that an empress could be a political partner rather than merely a domestic companion had been thoroughly discredited, and the traditional expectations of feminine submission and modesty were reinforced with renewed vigor. Yet Messalina's legacy extended beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. She had created a model of feminine power that would inspire and terrify subsequent generations of Roman women. Her willingness to challenge convention, her refusal to accept traditional limitations, and her ultimate failure became a cautionary tale that was repeated in literature, philosophy, and political discourse for centuries. She remained a figure of fascination and horror, a woman who had pushed the boundaries of possibility so far that she had ultimately destroyed herself and everything she had sought to achieve. The story of Messalina's marriage to Claudius became, in many ways, the definitive example of what could go wrong when the careful balance of Roman marriage was disrupted by ambition, passion, and the intoxicating possibilities of unlimited power. Her career demonstrated that even in a society that offered women few opportunities for independent action, a sufficiently determined and talented individual could create possibilities that had never existed before. Yet it also showed that such innovations came with risks that could prove fatal, not only to the individual who attempted them, but to the broader social order that they challenged Dot in the quiet hours of the night, when the palace had been cleansed of all traces of Messalina's presence, and Claudius lay alone in the bed they had once shared. The emperor must have reflected on the extraordinary woman he had married and destroyed. She had been everything that Roman society claimed to want. In a wife beautiful, intelligent, fertile, ambitious for her family's advancement. Yet she had also been everything that Roman society feared in a woman: independent, powerful, uncontrollable, willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions about gender and authority that held their civilization together. Her death had restored order and stability, but it had also eliminated a unique force of nature that would never be seen again in the imperial court. Deep beneath the volcanic ash that buried Pompeii in 79 CE, archaeologists have uncovered a treasure trove of intimate artifacts that reveal the hidden, emotional landscape of Roman marriage in ways that no literary source could ever capture. Among the most poignant of these discoveries are the engagement ring's delicate bands of gold and silver that once encircled the fingers of young Roman women, bearing inscriptions that speak across the centuries of love, possession, obsession, and promises that were destined to be broken. These small circles of metal, no larger than a child's finger, carry within their engravings a complex code of meaning that illuminates the darker aspects of Roman matrimonial culture. The tradition of the engagement ring in Roman society was far more than a simple declaration of intent to marry. It was a legal instrument that formally established the betrothal contract, a symbol of possession that marked the woman as claimed property, and a mystical object that was believed to create supernatural bonds between the engaged couple. The ring was typically presented during the sponsalia ceremony, the formal betrothal that often took place years before the actual wedding, sometimes when the bride-to-be was as young as 7 or 8 years old. From the moment the ring was placed on her finger, the young woman's life was fundamentally altered, her future determined by the man who had claimed her and the families who had negotiated her fate. The most common type of engagement ring was the annulus promubis, a simple band of iron or bronze that symbolized the unbreakable nature of the matrimonial bond. Yet among the wealthy families of Pompeii and Herculaneum, archaeologists have discovered rings of extraordinary sophistication and beauty-delicate gold bands set with precious stones, adorned with intricate carvings and inscribed with messages that reveal the complex emotional dynamics of Roman betrothal. These rings were not merely symbols, but active participants in the psychological drama of arranged marriage, designed to shape the thoughts and feelings of their wearers through constant physical contact and visual reminder. One of the most remarkable discoveries was found in the Villa of the Papyri, buried in the ruins of Herculaneum. The ring belonged to a young woman named Claudia Fortunata, whose skeletal remains were found in what appeared to be a bridal chamber, surrounded by the elaborate preparations for a wedding that would never take place. The ring itself is a masterpiece of Roman goldsmithing, a delicate band adorned with tiny emeralds and inscribed with words that have puzzled scholars for decades. Dominus meus vita me, my master, my life. The inscription reveals the fundamental power dynamic that governed Roman engagement, transforming the romantic notion of betrothal into a stark declaration of ownership and submission. The archaeological evidence suggests that Claudia Fortunata was approximately 16 years old when Vesuvius erupted, caught in the final preparations for her wedding to a man whose identity remains unknown. The artifacts found in her chamber tell a story of meticulous preparation and desperate haute cosmetic implements arranged with obsessive precision, wedding jewelry laid out according to careful ritual requirements, and personal effects that suggest a young woman trying to convince herself that her arranged marriage might somehow lead to happiness. Yet the inscription on her engagement ring tells a different story, one of resignation and acceptance of a fate that would transform her from an individual into a possession. The practice of inscribing engagement rings with possessive messages was widespread among Roman families, But the specific language used reveals fascinating variations in how different social classes understood the nature of matrimonial relationships. Archaeological evidence from across the empire shows rings bearing inscriptions such as anima me, my soul, domina facta, maid mistress, and vinculum aeternum, eternal chain. These phrases were not expressions of romantic sentiment, but legal and mystical formulas that were believed to create supernatural bonds between the engaged couple, making separation impossible and ensuring the woman's complete submission to her future husband's will. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these inscriptions is their revelation of the psychological manipulation that Roman society employed to ensure feminine compliance with arranged marriages. The rings were designed to be worn constantly, creating a physical reminder of the woman's changed status and her obligations to her future husband. The inscriptions served as daily affirmations of her new identity, repeated mantras that gradually shaped her self-perception and emotional responses. Young women who might have harbored dreams of independence or romantic love found themselves confronted hundreds of times, each day with messages that reinforced their status as property and their duty to submit. The technical sophistication of these rings reveals the enormous importance that Roman society placed on the psychological aspects of betrothal and marriage. The goldsmiths who created them were master craftsmen who understood not only the aesthetic requirements of beautiful jewelry, but also the mystical and psychological functions that these objects were meant to serve. Many rings feature hidden compartments that contained locks of the future husband's hair, small scrolls with additional magical inscriptions, or tiny amulets designed to ensure fertility and marital harmony. These hidden elements were known only to the woman who wore the ring, creating a secret relationship between the bride-to-be and the object that symbolized her bondage. The archaeological record also reveals the tragic frequency with which these betrothal rings were associated with broken promises and abandoned marriages. Excavations throughout the Roman world have uncovered caches of engagement rings that were apparently discarded or hidden when marriages were dissolved, families fell from favor, or political circumstances changed. These forgotten rings, buried in household shrines or hidden in secret compartments, represent the countless Roman women whose carefully planned futures were destroyed by forces beyond their control: war, plague, economic collapse, or simply the changing whims of powerful men. One particularly poignant discovery was made in the ruins of a villa outside Rome, where archaeologists found a collection of 7 engagement rings hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what appeared to be a young woman's bedroom. The rings all bore different inscriptions and came from different periods, suggesting that they belonged to a woman who had been betrothed multiple times, but never actually married. The reasons for these repeated broken engagements can only be speculated upon, but the hidden cache suggests a woman who had been repeatedly claimed and abandoned, her life shaped by promises that were never fulfilled and hopes that were systematically destroyed. The mystical aspects of Roman engagement rings extended far beyond their role as symbols of betrothal. They were believed to possess supernatural powers that could influence the emotional and physical relationship between the engaged couple. Certain inscriptions were thought to create unbreakable bonds of affection, while others were designed to ensure the woman's fertility and the production of male heirs. Some rings incorporated astrological symbols that were calculated according to the birth dates of both parties, creating mystical connections that were supposed to overcome any natural incompatibility between the prospective spouses. In the shadowed storage rooms of museums across Europe, thousands of Roman engagement rings lie cataloged and forgotten, each one a silent witness to promises that were never kept and dreams that were systematically destroyed. These artifacts, excavated from sites throughout the former Roman Empire, tell stories that the official histories never recorded, tales of young women whose carefully planned marriages collapsed due to war, disease, political upheaval, or simple masculine caprice. The archaeological record reveals that for every successful Roman marriage celebrated in literature and law, there were countless others that ended before they began, leaving behind only these small circles of metal as evidence of hopes that were raised and then brutally crushed. The most haunting discoveries come from emergency burial sites, where families fleeing sudden disasters were forced to abandon their most precious possessions. In a villa outside Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered a leather pouch containing 12 engagement rings of varying sizes and styles, apparently collected by a woman who had been helping other families prepare for evacuation when Vesuvius erupted. The rings belonged to women ranging in age from children to elderly matrons, suggesting that the disaster struck during wedding season when multiple marriages were being planned simultaneously. Each ring bears its own inscription and tells its own story of interrupted lives and abandoned futures. The analysis of these emergency caches reveals patterns that illuminate the fragile nature of Roman matrimonial arrangements. Many rings show evidence of having been worn for extended periods, years, in some cases, before being removed and hidden or discarded. The wear patterns suggest women who had been engaged for long periods while their families negotiated the complex details of dowries, property transfers, and political alliances. Some rings were clearly removed in haste, with bent bands and scratched surfaces that indicate desperate attempts to hide or destroy them before fleeing approaching danger. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries was made in the ruins of a villa near Herculaneum, where researchers found what appeared to be a workshop dedicated to the creation and modification of engagement rings. The site contained hundreds of partially completed rings, engraving tools, supplies of precious metals and stones, and most remarkably, a collection of pattern books that showed the approved designs and inscriptions for different types of matrimonial jewelry. The workshop appears to have specialized in creating rings that could be quickly customized for specific betrothals, suggesting a thriving industry dedicated to the production of these symbols of feminine bondage. The pattern books found in this workshop provide unprecedented insight into the systematic nature of Roman psychological manipulation through jewelry. The designs are organized according to the age of the intended bride, the social status of both families, the length of the intended engagement period, and even the specific emotional challenges that the marriage was expected to face. Young brides received rings with inscriptions emphasizing obedience and submission, while older women who had been previously married were given messages focusing on loyalty and devotion. Women marrying above their social station received rings with inscriptions designed to remind them of their good fortune and their obligation to their new families. Perhaps most disturbing are the sections of the pattern books dedicated to problem cases, engagements where the families anticipated resistance from the bride or difficulties in maintaining the marriage arrangement. These rings featured particularly sophisticated psychological programming, with inscriptions designed to create feelings of guilt, dependency, and fear of abandonment. Some included magical formulas that were supposed to suppress independent thought and ensure emotional compliance, while others incorporated symbols from mystery religions that promised spiritual punishment for disobedience or betrayal. The archaeological evidence also reveals the existence of a thriving black market in engagement rings, catering to families who needed to quickly replace rings that had been lost, stolen, or destroyed. Hidden caches of rings have been found throughout the Roman world, apparently stockpiled by merchants who specialized in providing emergency replacements for matrimonial jewelry. These underground suppliers understood that the loss of an engagement ring could disrupt carefully planned marriages and potentially destroy family alliances, making their services essential despite the legal and social risks involved. The technical analysis of these rings has revealed sophisticated metallurgical techniques that were specifically designed to make them difficult to remove or destroy. Many rings were crafted with hidden barbs or catches that would cause pain if the wearer attempted to remove them forcibly. Others were made with alloys that would discolor or irritate the skin if tampered with, creating physical reminders of any attempt to reject the engagement. The most elaborate examples included mechanisms that would actually tighten around the finger if the wearer attempted to slide them off, creating a form of physical bondage that matched the psychological control they were designed to exert. Geographical distribution of these rings across the Roman Empire provides additional insight into the standardization of matrimonial practices and the systematic nature of feminine oppression in Roman society. Similar designs and inscriptions appear from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, suggesting that the psychological techniques employed in Roman marriage were not local customs, but empire-wide policies designed to ensure uniformity in gender relations. The rings found in frontier provinces often include additional elements designed to reinforce Roman cultural values among populations that might otherwise maintain their traditional marriage customs. Archaeological evidence from military sites reveals that engagement rings played important roles in the marriages of soldiers and their families. Legionary camps throughout the empire have yielded caches of rings apparently sent home by soldiers who had been killed in battle, intended for brides who would never receive them. These posthumous discoveries tell stories of men who had carried engagement rings for years, waiting for the end of their military service and the opportunity to claim their promised wives. The rings often show evidence of having been carefully maintained and protected despite the harsh conditions of military life, suggesting that even hardened soldiers understood the importance of these symbols in maintaining their connections to civilian society. The study of ring inscriptions has also revealed the existence of coded communication systems that allowed families to exchange information about matrimonial negotiations without revealing sensitive details to potential rivals or enemies. Certain combinations of symbols and letters served as shorthand for dowry amounts, political affiliations, and even personal characteristics of the intended bride or groom. These codes were apparently standardized across large regions of the empire, enabling families to conduct complex matrimonial negotiations through the apparently innocent exchange of jewelry designs and inscription patterns. The most profound archaeological discoveries relating to Roman marriage have been found not in the grand villas of the wealthy or the public spaces where official ceremonies took place, but in the humble domestic contexts where ordinary women lived out their daily struggles with matrimonial bondage. In the corners of forgotten rooms, beneath the floors of modest houses, and hidden within the walls of buildings that have stood for 2 millennia, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a parallel world of feminine experience that challenges everything we thought we knew about Roman marriage. These discoveries speak in a language of symbols, wear patterns, and chemical traces that reveals the true emotional and psychological cost of a system that prioritized social stability over individual happiness. One of the most significant recent discoveries was made during the restoration of a Roman house in the Subura district of Rome, where workers uncovered a sealed chamber that had apparently been deliberately concealed sometime in the 2nd century CE. The room contained the personal possessions of a woman named Livia Drusilla, not the famous empress, but an ordinary citizen whose life had been documented through a cache of artifacts that she had carefully preserved and hidden. Among her possessions were 7 engagement rings, each representing a different phase of her life and a different set of broken promises. The scientific analysis of Livia's rings has provided unprecedented insight into the emotional journey of a Roman woman whose life was shaped by repeated betrayals and abandoned marriages. The earliest ring, clearly made for a child's finger, bears the inscription Puella Devota, devoted girl, and shows evidence of having been worn constantly for several years. Chemical analysis of the metal reveals traces of tears, suggesting that the young Livia had wept while wearing this ring. her emotions literally leaving their mark on the object that symbolized her bondage. The wear patterns indicate that she had frequently twisted and manipulated the ring, a nervous habit that speaks to her anxiety about the future that had been planned for her. The second ring in Livia's collection tells a different story, larger and more sophisticated, with an inscription reading Sponsa Fidei, Bride of Faith. It shows evidence of having been worn for only a brief period before being removed and stored away. The circumstances of its abandonment can only be inferred, but historical records from the period suggest that many marriages were disrupted by the political upheavals of the Antonine period, when shifting alliances and economic instability made previously secure matrimonial arrangements suddenly untenable. The remaining rings in Livia's collection chart her progression through a series of failed engagements, each one more desperate than the last. As she aged and her marriage prospects diminished, the inscriptions on her rings became increasingly focused on her value as a domestic manager rather than as a romantic partner. The final ring, clearly made when she was well into her 30s, bears the stark inscription Ancilla Domus, servant of the house, suggesting that her last engagement was to a man who viewed her primarily as a household manager rather than as a wife in any meaningful sense. The most heartbreaking aspect of Livia's collection is a small silver band that appears to have been made by her own hands. The workmanship is crude compared to the professionally crafted engagement rings, but the inscription is deeply personal. Spes mortua, hope is dead. This ring appears to have been created after her final engagement was broken, serving as a memorial to dreams that would never be fulfilled and possibilities that would never be explored. The fact that she included it in her hidden cache suggests that even in her despair, she recognized the historical importance of documenting her experience for future generations. Archaeological analysis of domestic spaces throughout the Roman world has revealed similar caches of abandoned matrimonial jewelry, each one telling its own story of broken promises and shattered dreams. The patterns that emerge from these discoveries paint a picture of systematic feminine suffering that was carefully hidden from public view. Roman women who found themselves trapped in cycles of failed engagements and abandoned marriages developed sophisticated techniques for preserving evidence of their experiences, creating archaeological records that would survive long after their own stories had been forgotten. Metallurgical analysis of these rings has also revealed evidence of a practice that was never mentioned in literary sources: the deliberate poisoning of engagement rings as a form of slow murder. Chemical traces found on several rings suggest that they were treated with compounds that would gradually poison their wearers, causing chronic illness and eventually death. This practice appears to have been used by families who wanted to eliminate brides who had become inconvenient or problematic, allowing them to break marriage contracts while maintaining the fiction that the woman had died of natural causes. Discovery of poisoned rings has led to a re-examination of historical accounts of mysterious illnesses and unexplained deaths among young Roman women. Many cases that were previously attributed to disease or accident now appear to have been deliberate murders carried out through contaminated jewelry. The sophistication of the techniques used suggests that this was not an isolated practice, but a systematic method of eliminating unwanted brides that was known and utilized by families throughout the empire. Perhaps even more disturbing is the archaeological evidence of psychological torture through modified engagement rings. Some rings were deliberately crafted with internal mechanisms that would cause pain or discomfort when worn, creating a constant reminder of the wearer's subjugation and helplessness. Others included compartments containing substances that would cause skin irritation or discoloration, marking the woman as possessed while simultaneously punishing her for her status. These devices represent a level of calculated cruelty that goes far beyond simple oppression, suggesting that some Roman families took active pleasure in the suffering of their daughters and daughters-in-law. The archaeological record also reveals evidence of a practice that historians have termed matrimonial terrorism, the use of engagement rings to convey specific threats and warnings to prospective brides. Rings with inscriptions that referenced violent punishments, magical curses, or divine retribution were apparently used to intimidate women who showed signs of resistance to their planned marriages. Some rings included actual threats written in code, warning of specific consequences that would follow any attempt to escape or rebel against family. Arrangements. The psychological impact of these terroristic practices can be seen in the archaeological evidence of self-harm among Roman women. Excavations of domestic sites have revealed hidden caches of sharp objects that appear to have been used for cutting and scarification, often in patterns that correspond to the inscriptions on engagement rings. These discoveries suggest that some women internalized the violence that was threatened against them, turning it against themselves as a form of psychological release or spiritual purification. The material evidence also reveals the existence of counter-magical practices that Roman women developed to protect themselves from the psychological and spiritual attacks that engagement rings were designed to deliver. Hidden caches of protective amulets, counterspells written on lead tablets, and specially crafted jewelry designed to neutralize hostile magic have been found throughout the Roman world. These discoveries suggest that many women understood the supernatural dimensions of their oppression and developed sophisticated responses to protect themselves from magical as well as physical violence. One of the most remarkable discoveries was made in a villa outside Ostia, where archaeologists found what appears to have been a school for training young women in resistance techniques. The site contained instructional materials for identifying and neutralizing poison jewelry, techniques for modifying engagement rings to reduce their psychological impact, and methods for creating protective talismans that could counteract hostile magic. The school appears to have operated in secret for several decades during the 2nd century CE, suggesting that organized resistance to the matrimonial system was more widespread and sophisticated than previously understood. At the apex of Roman society, where wealth flowed like water and political power determined the fate of nations, marriage became an art form of such complexity and extravagance that it bore little resemblance to the intimate unions that ordinary people might recognize. The patrician weddings of the late Republic and early Empire were spectacular performances that could cost more than the annual budget of a small province, involving hundreds of participants, months of preparation, and negotiations so intricate that they required teams of lawyers, accountants, and political strategists to complete. These were not celebrations of love, but carefully choreographed displays of power, designed to announce new political alliances, demonstrate family wealth, and establish the social hierarchy that would govern Roman life for generations to come. The wedding of Pompey the Great to Julia, daughter of Julius Caesar, in 59 BCE, provides a perfect example of how matrimonial politics operated at the highest levels of Roman society. The union was negotiated as part of the first triumvirate, a secret alliance between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus that effectively controlled the Roman Republic. Julia was 18 years old and had been engaged to another man, but political necessity required that her engagement be broken and her hand transferred to Pompey, who was old enough to be her father and had already been married twice. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to announce the new alliance while demonstrating the power of the men who had arranged it. The preparations for this wedding began nearly a year before the ceremony, with teams of specialists working to create an event that would surpass every previous display of Roman magnificence. The venue selected was the Campus Martis, transformed into an elaborate outdoor theater with temporary buildings constructed specifically for the occasion. The guest list included every significant political figure in the Roman world, with invitations serving as declarations of political allegiance and the seating arrangements, carefully designed to reflect the new power structures that the marriage represented. The dowry negotiations for Julia's marriage were so complex that they required the services of dozens of legal experts and financial advisors. Caesar provided his daughter with a dowry that included cash equivalent to several years of provincial tax revenue, extensive properties throughout Italy and the provinces, a collection of artistic treasures that had been assembled over generations, and most importantly, a network of political obligations and alliances that made her marriage to Pompey advantageous to both families. Yet this was merely the beginning of the financial arrangements, as Pompey was expected to provide matching gifts that demonstrated his ability to maintain Julia in the style appropriate to her status. The clothing for this wedding was designed by teams of specialists who worked for months to create garments that would establish new standards of luxury and taste. Julia's wedding dress was woven from silk imported from the farthest reaches of the empire, dyed with purple so expensive that the cost of the fabric alone exceeded the annual income of most senators. The dress was adorned with pearls from the Yas, Red Sea, emeralds from Egypt, and gold thread that had been specially crafted by the finest artisans in Alexandria. Every detail was calculated to demonstrate not only the bride's beauty, but the financial resources and international connections of her family. The religious ceremonies associated with elite Roman weddings were equally elaborate and politically significant. The wedding of Pompey and Julia required the participation of dozens of priests and augurs, each representing different aspects of the divine approval that was necessary to legitimize the union. The sacrificial offerings included rare animals, imported from distant provinces, expensive incense from Arabia, and elaborate ritual objects that had been commissioned specifically for the ceremony. The religious aspects of the wedding were not merely ceremonial, but served important political functions, demonstrating that the gods approved of the new alliance and that opposition to it would constitute blasphemy as well as treason. The dowry negotiations that accompanied elite Roman marriages were financial exercises of such complexity and absurdity that they resembled elaborate games played with the economic resources of entire nations. The sums involved were not merely large, they were deliberately incomprehensible, designed to demonstrate wealth that exceeded rational calculation and to establish hierarchies of power that could only be maintained through the continuous circulation of impossible amounts of money, property, and precious objects. The dowry of Tullia, daughter of Cicero, included assets valued at more than the annual revenue of several Roman provinces. Yet this was considered modest by the standards of the most prestigious families, who competed to arrange marriages that would bankrupt lesser nobles and establish their own financial supremacy as unassailable. The basic structure of Roman dowry negotiations involved multiple rounds of offers and counteroffers that could continue for months or even years before reaching a conclusion. The initial discussions focused on establishing the fundamental parameters of the exchange. The bride's family would provide a dowry consisting of cash, property, slaves, and valuable objects, while the groom's family would offer security arrangements that guaranteed the bride's support and provided for the return of her dowry should the marriage end in divorce or widowhood. Yet these simple principles became nightmarishly complex when applied to families whose wealth and political connections made every financial decision a matter of imperial significance. The cash component of elite dowries was calculated using formulas that took into account not only the immediate financial resources of both families, but also their projected earnings from political offices, their potential inheritance from aging relatives, their expected profits from commercial ventures, and their access to credit from banking networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean world. The bride's family was expected to provide liquid assets sufficient to fund the groom's political career for at least a decade, while also demonstrating their ability to support additional financial demands that might arise from unexpected political opportunities or crises. The property transfers associated with elite marriages involved real estate holdings that spanned multiple provinces and included everything from urban palaces to rural estates, commercial warehouses to sacred groves, harbors to mines. The legal documentation required to transfer these properties was so complex that it required teams of specialists working for months to ensure that all titles were clear, all tax obligations were properly assigned, and all political implications were understood and addressed. The mere act of conducting surveys and appraisals for a major dowry negotiation could require the services of hundreds of experts and cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. The slave component of Roman dowries represented perhaps the most morally complex aspect of these financial arrangements. Elite brides typically brought with them households of several hundred slaves, each with specialized skills and significant monetary value. These human beings were evaluated, appraised, and transferred like any other form of property, but their specialized knowledge and personal relationships often made them more valuable than gold or precious stones. A skilled cook who knew the dietary preferences of important political figures, a secretary who was fluent in multiple languages and familiar with diplomatic protocols, or a bodyguard who had demonstrated absolute loyalty could be worth more than entire estates. The artistic and cultural treasures that formed part of elite dowries were often accumulated over generations and represented not only enormous financial value, but also the cultural sophistication and international connections of the families involved. These collections might include paintings by celebrated artists, sculptures by renowned masters, libraries containing rare manuscripts, and musical instruments crafted by legendary artisans. The negotiation of these cultural assets required expertise in art history, literature, and music, as well as the ability to assess the political implications of owning objects that might be associated with particular philosophical schools or cultural traditions. At the highest levels of Roman society, marriage became an elaborate form of theater where every participant wore carefully crafted masks that concealed their true thoughts, feelings, and intentions behind performances so sophisticated that even the actors themselves sometimes forgot where the performance ended and reality began. The social world of elite Roman matrimony was a stage where emotions were props, conversations were scripts, and genuine human connection was not merely discouraged, but actively dangerous to the political and financial interests that these marriages were designed to serve. The participants in this grand masquerade developed skills that would have impressed professional actors, learning to project happiness while experiencing misery, to simulate affection while feeling contempt, and to maintain the appearance of domestic harmony while engaging in constant warfare behind the scenes. The mourning rituals of elite Roman wives were elaborate preparations for daily performances that required the same attention to detail that theatrical productions demanded. The selection of clothing, jewelry, and cosmetics was not based on personal preference, but on the specific political messages that needed to be communicated to the various audiences that would observe the wife's public appearances throughout the day. A particular style of hair arrangement might signal support for a specific political faction, while the choice of gemstones could communicate information about family alliances or commercial relationships. The application of cosmetics followed, precise formulas designed to project youth, fertility, and contentment regardless of the woman's actual age, health, or emotional state. The language used in elite Roman marriages was a sophisticated code that allowed participants to communicate essential information while maintaining the fiction of marital harmony. Compliments delivered in public often contained subtle criticisms or warnings that only the intended recipient would understand. Expressions of affection served as reminders of obligations and expectations rather than genuine emotional communications. Even the most intimate conversations between spouses were conducted according to protocols that prioritized political considerations over personal authenticity. creating relationships that were simultaneously intimate and completely artificial. Social calendar of elite Ramon families was organized around events that provided opportunities for matrimonial performance and political maneuvering. Dinner parties, religious festivals, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial games all served as stages where married couples could display their relationships to audiences whose approval or disapproval could influence their family's political and financial prospects. The success of these performances was measured not by the participants' happiness or satisfaction, but by their effectiveness in advancing family interests and maintaining social position. The art of conversation at elite Roman social gatherings was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of matrimonial performance. Participants were expected to discuss topics that demonstrated their education, political awareness, and cultural sophistication while avoiding subjects that might reveal genuine emotions or personal opinions that could be used against them. The wives were particularly skilled at this form of communication, having been trained from childhood to engage in discussions that appeared substantive and intelligent, while actually revealing nothing that could compromise their family's interests. Physical choreography of elite Roman marriages was equally elaborate and meaningful. The way a wife positioned herself in relation to her husband, the timing of her entrances and exits at social events, the gestures she used to express agreement or deference, all of these behaviors were carefully calculated to communicate specific messages about the relationship and the political alliances it represented. Even seemingly spontaneous displays of affection were often rehearsed performances designed to reassure audiences about the stability of the marriage and the reliability of the political arrangements it supported. The private spaces of elite Roman homes were designed to facilitate these matrimonial performances, while also providing opportunities for the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that was essential to maintaining successful political marriages. The arrangement of furniture, the selection of decorative objects, and even the training of household slaves were all organized to support the complex social theater that elite families were required to maintain. Visitors to these homes were essentially attending carefully staged productions where every detail had been designed to convey specific impressions about the family's wealth, political connections, and domestic harmony. The seasonal cycles of Roman social life provided opportunities for different types of matrimonial performance, each with its own requirements and challenges. The winter months, when families retreated to their private estates, allowed for more intimate performances focused on demonstrating domestic competence and family unity to smaller audiences of close associates and political allies. The spring festivals required more elaborate public displays designed to announce family news, celebrate political achievements, and establish the social agenda for the coming year. The summer campaign season often separated spouses for months at a time, creating opportunities for independent political maneuvering, while also requiring careful coordination to ensure that their separate activities supported common objectives. As our journey through the labyrinth of Roman marriage draws to its close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of past and present, carrying with us the weight of stories that speak across the centuries about the fundamental human struggle between individual desire and social expectation. The young woman we met at the beginning of our exploration, preparing for her arranged marriage with trembling hands and a carefully composed face, has walked with us through palace halls where empresses wielded power through scandal and manipulation, through archaeological sites where broken rings tell stories of resistance and rebellion, and through the glittering social theaters where the wealthiest families in the world performed elaborate charades of domestic happiness while their hearts remained strangers to genuine affection. The Roman approach to marriage was not an aberration or a curious historical footnote, but rather a sophisticated system designed to serve the needs of a civilization that prioritized order, stability, and collective prosperity over individual happiness and personal fulfillment. Every aspect of this system, from the calculated negotiations that determined matrimonial matches to the psychological conditioning that prepared young women for lives of submission. From the elaborate dowry arrangements that redistributed wealth across the empire to the constant performances that maintained the fiction of domestic harmony was carefully engineered to support the broader political and economic structures that made Roman dominance possible. Yet, as we have seen through archaeological evidence, historical accounts, and the preserved remnants of lived experience, this system was never as stable or successful as its architects intended. Beneath the surface of legal compliance and social conformity, Roman women developed sophisticated networks of resistance, support, and mutual protection that operated in parallel to the official institutions of marriage and family. The engagement rings that were supposed to ensure psychological submission became the focus of counter-magical practices designed to preserve autonomy and authentic emotion. The arranged marriages that were meant to create stable political alliances often generated the very conflicts and instabilities they were designed to prevent. The elaborate performances of marital happiness frequently concealed relationships that were characterized by loneliness, resentment, and spiritual emptiness. The figure of Messalina stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of what happened when Roman women refused to accept the limitations that marriage was supposed to impose upon them. Her extraordinary career demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers that awaited women who attempted to use the system for their own purposes rather than simply submitting to its demands. Her ultimate destruction served as both a warning to other women who might be tempted to follow her example and a reminder of the violent consequences that awaited those who pushed too far against the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Yet even in her failure, Messalina established a model of feminine power and independence that would inspire and terrify subsequent generations. The archaeological evidence we have examined reveals the profound emotional cost of a system that treated marriage as a political and economic transaction rather than a human relationship. The hidden caches of broken rings, the evidence of systematic poisoning and psychological torture, the traces of resistance networks, and protective rituals all speak to the desperate measures that Roman women employed to preserve some element of autonomy and authentic feeling in relationships that were designed to eliminate both. These discoveries remind us that behind every legal document and historical account stood real human beings, whose lives were shaped by forces largely beyond their control, but who nonetheless found ways to assert their humanity and maintain hope for something better. The elite marriage practices that we explored in our final segment represent the logical extreme of treating matrimony as a form of political theater rather than an intimate relationship between two individuals. The elaborate negotiations, spectacular ceremonies, and constant performances that characterized these unions demonstrated the enormous resources that Roman society was willing to invest in maintaining the fiction that political alliances could be successfully disguised as loving relationships. Yet the very sophistication of these performances paradoxically revealed their artificial nature, creating marriages that were masterpieces of social engineering, but failures as human relationships. Perhaps the most profound lesson to be drawn from our exploration of Roman marriage is the recognition that the freedom to choose our own partners, to marry for love rather than political advantage, and to build relationships based on mutual affection and shared values represents one of the most precious achievements of modern civilization. The young Roman bride whose story began our journey had no such choices. Her life was determined by the matrimonial negotiations of men she barely knew. Her emotions were shaped by years of psychological conditioning, and her future was bounded by expectations that left no room for individual dreams or personal ambitions. Yet we should not make the mistake of believing that the Roman approach to marriage was entirely without merit, or that our modern practices have solved all the challenges that matrimony presents. The Roman emphasis on family stability, social responsibility, and long-term planning created marriages that often endured for decades and provided security and support for children and elderly relatives in ways that our more individualistic approach sometimes fails to achieve. The careful attention to compatibility in terms of social background, economic status, and cultural values often produced relationships that, while lacking romantic passion, provided stable foundations for family life and social advancement. Roman understanding of marriage as an institution that served broader social purposes rather than merely individual happiness also created frameworks for managing the complex economic and political relationships that hold civilizations together. The dowry systems, alliance networks, and ceremonial practices that we have examined were not merely empty rituals, but functional mechanisms for distributing resources, managing conflicts, and maintaining social cohesion across vast and diverse populations. As we reflect on the contrast between Roman matrimonial practices and our own, we might also consider the pressures and constraints that continue to shape modern marriage in ways that we do not always acknowledge or understand. The economic pressures that influence partner selection, the social expectations that shape our understanding of successful relationships, and the cultural narratives that define appropriate gender roles all echo, in modified forms, the kinds of systematic influences that shaped Roman marriage. While we celebrate our freedom to marry for love, we should also recognize that this freedom operates within constraints that are perhaps less visible but not necessarily less powerful than those that governed Roman matrimonial choices. The archaeological evidence of resistance and rebellion that we discovered in Roman sites should remind us that human beings have always found ways to assert their autonomy and preserve their authentic emotions, even under the most oppressive circumstances. The networks of support and protection that Roman women created, the techniques they developed for subverting psychological control, and the courage they displayed in challenging seemingly omnipotent systems of authority provide inspiration and guidance for anyone who faces constraints on their freedom to love and be loved according to their own values and desires. The story of Roman marriage is ultimately the story of the eternal human struggle between individual desire and collective responsibility, between personal happiness and social stability, between the heart's longings and the mind's calculations. This struggle was not resolved by Roman civilization, nor has it been resolved by our own. Each generation must find its own balance between competing claims and conflicting values. Each individual must navigate the tension between what they want and what is expected of them. Each couple must discover how to build authentic relationships within the constraints imposed by their particular historical and cultural circumstances. As we return to our own time and our own choices, we carry with us the voices of those Roman women whose stories we have shared, the young bride learning to smile without feeling, the empress who refused to disappear into her husband's identity, the anonymous women who hid rings and created networks of resistance, the elite matrons who performed happiness while experiencing profound loneliness. Their experiences remind us that the freedom to choose our own partners and build relationships based on mutual affection represents not a natural right, but a precious achievement that required centuries of struggle and sacrifice to accomplish. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the demands of daily life recede and we find ourselves alone with our thoughts and feelings, we might spare a moment to appreciate the extraordinary privilege of living in a time and place where marriage can be a choice rather than an obligation, where love can be celebrated rather than hidden, and where the search for a compatible partner can be guided by hope rather than fear. The Roman women whose stories we have shared would have envied us this freedom, even as they might have wondered whether we truly understand its value or use it wisely. The weight of their ancient choices continues to shape our world in ways both visible and hidden, reminding us that every marriage, every relationship, every decision to commit ourselves to another human being participates in the long human conversation about how we can live together with dignity, compassion, and hope. In honoring their struggles and learning from their experiences, we perhaps come closer to understanding both the possibilities and the responsibilities that accompany the precious freedom to love and be loved according to the dictates of our own hearts.